I want you to imagine spending 3 months convinced you were losing your mind, only to find out the truth had been sitting behind a shoebox of photographs the entire time. That's exactly what happened to me. My name is Evelyn Harper, and I am 77 years old, and until this past spring, I believed I knew my own children better than I knew myself. I was wrong about one of them for almost 30 years. If you're new here, welcome. And if you've been with me before, thank you for coming back. I tell stories like this one because I think there's something we owe each other, the people who've lived long enough to look back and actually see the shape of things. So if this story moves you even a little, I'd ask you to hit that like button, and if you want to hear more of these, subscribe, because I have so many more to tell you. Now let me start from the beginning, because this one deserves to be told slowly. I live in Portland, Oregon, in a house on Northwest Raleigh Street that my husband Robert and I bought back in 1979, when the Alphabet District still had more hardware stores than coffee shops, and you could hear the rain on the roof at night without a single car alarm interrupting it. Robert taught high school physics for 34 years. I taught literature, mostly Victorian novels, mostly to teenagers who would rather have been anywhere else, until I retired in 2009. We raised 2 children in that house, Thomas, who is 56 now, and Margaret, who is 52. I want you to picture that house the way I see it every morning when I come down for coffee. The wood floors that creak in exactly the same 3 places they always have. The rain against the window over the kitchen sink. A grandfather clock in the hallway that Robert's father gave us as a wedding present, ticking the same way it has ticked for 46 years. And against the far wall of what used to be Robert's study, a tall wooden bookshelf, oak, built sometime in the 1950s by a previous owner. The kind of shelf that has seen every era of this family pass in front of it. That bookshelf is where this whole story begins. But before I tell you what I found there, I need you to understand who my daughter was before any of this, because the woman I am about to describe to you is not someone you would expect to be hiding anything. Margaret runs a small independent bookstore here in Portland, not far from where she grew up. It is the kind of shop where the floor is slightly uneven and the smell of old paper and fresh coffee mixes together in a way that makes you want to stay for hours. She has run it for almost 20 years. She married a good man, Daniel Collins, a contractor who has remodeled half the houses on our street at one point or another, and they built a quiet, steady life together. No children of their own, by choice, something Margaret never apologized for, and I never questioned. She is careful. She is private. She has always been the kind of person who remembers everyone's birthday and never raises her voice, not even when she has every right to. So when I tell you that over the last year, my daughter started flinching every single time her own brother walked into a room, I need you to understand how strange that truly was. This was not a woman prone to drama. This was a woman who, for 52 years, had never once given me a reason to worry about her state of mind. Let me describe it the way I actually lived it, because I think you'll start to feel what I felt. It would happen at family dinners, the ones we still try to have once a month, even though Robert has been gone 3 years now. Thomas would walk into the dining room, maybe just back from parking the car, and Margaret's whole body would change. Her shoulders would come up toward her ears. She would set down whatever she was holding very carefully, like she didn't trust her own hands anymore. And then, within 10 or 15 minutes, she would find some reason to excuse herself. A phone call she suddenly remembered. A headache. Once, memorably, a candle she was certain she'd left burning at the shop, though Daniel later told me, quietly, that the shop doesn't even have candles in it anymore, not since the city tightened the fire code 2 years back. I noticed it the first time at Easter. I told myself it was nothing. People have off days. I noticed it again at a cousin's retirement party in the summer. I told myself it was the crowd, the noise. Maybe Margaret was just tired. By the time autumn came around, I had stopped telling myself anything because the pattern had become impossible to unsee. Every single time, every single gathering, the same flinch, the same retreat, the same careful, polite excuse that never quite added up. I want to pause here for just a moment because I think some of you watching this have lived something similar. Maybe not with a sibling, maybe with a friend, a parent, someone you loved who started pulling away in small, quiet pieces, and everyone around you kept saying it was nothing. If that's you, I want you to tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. What city? What state? Because it helps me to know this isn't just my story, it's something a lot of us carry. And if you've ever doubted your own instincts the way I'm about to tell you, I doubted mine, go ahead and like this video, because that part is coming, and I think you'll understand it in your bones. Now let me go back to where I left off. By the time the leaves had turned that year, I had started keeping a quiet list in my head, the way you do when you're trying to convince yourself a thing is real before you say it out loud to anyone. Margaret had canceled 3 dinners with Daniel and me in a row, each time with a different excuse that sounded perfectly reasonable on its own. She had stopped answering my calls on Sunday evenings, which had been our ritual since she went away to college 30 years ago. She had started looking, when she did show up, like a woman carrying something heavy that she had decided not to set down in front of anyone. And there was the bookshelf. I should tell you about the bookshelf properly now, because it matters more than almost anything else in this story. After Robert passed, Margaret took it upon herself to go through some of his old things, the way grief makes people need a project, something with their hands to do while their heart catches up. She spent an entire weekend reorganizing that bookshelf in his old study, dusting every volume, alphabetizing what could be alphabetized, putting his old engineering magazines into labeled boxes. It seemed like a kindness at the time, a daughter honoring her father's memory. But here is what I noticed, and what I let myself dismiss for far too long. After that weekend, Margaret never let anyone else touch that shelf again. Not me. Not the cleaning woman who comes twice a month. Not Daniel, who once tried to help me move a box of old photo albums during a visit, and was met with a sharpness in Margaret's voice I had never heard directed at her own husband before. "I'll handle it," she said. Just that. 4 words. Said too fast, too final. I let it go. I told myself grief makes people territorial about strange, small things. I had been there myself once, after my own mother passed, suddenly furious that someone had moved her sewing basket 6 inches to the left. If you've ever caught yourself explaining away a small thing that deep down you knew wasn't actually small, I want you to sit with that feeling for just a second, because that is exactly where I was standing for almost a year of my life. Tell me, has there ever been a moment like that for you, something you saw clearly but talked yourself out of? Drop it in the comments below. I read every single one. And if this story is already pulling something up in you, hit that like button now before we go any further, because what's coming next is the part that changed everything. It was March of this year when I finally went looking through that study myself. I want to tell you exactly why, because the reason matters. Our family attorney, a kind, patient man named Gerald Whitfield, who has handled the Harper family's affairs since before Robert and I were married, had called me about a small piece of unfinished business from the estate. There was an old insurance policy of Robert's, something from decades back, that needed an original document to be located and filed before a deadline closed it out for good. I knew exactly where Robert used to keep things like that. In his study. In that bookshelf, on the 3rd shelf from the top, behind the row of engineering textbooks he never could bring himself to throw away. Margaret was at the shop that afternoon. Daniel was out at a job site. I was alone in the house, the rain coming down soft and steady the way it does most days here in Portland, and I climbed the small step stool I keep folded behind the study door. And I reached behind those textbooks the way I had seen Robert do 100 times over 40 years. My hand found a shoebox first. Old photographs, the kind with white scalloped borders, faces from the 1960s and 70s looking back at me, Robert young and unbearably handsome, Thomas as a teenager with that same proud, careful smile he still has today. I set the shoebox on the desk, and I reached back into the space behind it. And that is when my fingers touched something I did not expect. A phone. Cold, dusty, the screen long since gone dark, tucked so far back into the shadow of that shelf that I would never have found it if I hadn't been reaching for something else entirely. I want you to understand, this was not my phone. It was not Robert's, who never quite trusted cell phones and kept a flip phone until the week he died. I turned it over in my hands, and on the back, almost worn away, was a small sticker, the kind you'd put on a phone case to personalize it. A pressed flower, laminated, faded nearly to nothing. I had seen that exact sticker before. Margaret had put one just like it on her very first smartphone back in 2011, a little inside joke between her and her father about the wildflowers that used to grow along the back fence before the city put in that new sidewalk. My stomach did something I can only describe as falling, the way it does when you're driving and you hit a patch of road that drops away faster than you expected. I sat down at Robert's old desk, the rain still going soft against the window, the grandfather clock ticking somewhere down the hall, and I held that dead phone in both hands like it might tell me something just from the weight of it. I did not call Margaret. I did not call Thomas. I drove, that very afternoon, to the little electronics shop on Northwest 23rd, where the young man behind the counter has fixed 3 of my own phones over the years, and I asked him, as calmly as I could manage, if there was any way to charge a phone this old. He looked at it for a long moment. "This is from years back," he said. "But yeah, give me 20 minutes." I sat in that shop and watched the rain through the front window, and I will tell you honestly, I have never in my life felt 20 minutes pass so slowly. If you're still with me right now, I need you to know something. I'm about to tell you what was on that phone, and it is not what you think. It is not violence. It is not anything ugly in the way the world has trained us to expect ugliness to look. What I found was something quieter, and in some ways, harder to carry. So before I go on, tell me where you're watching this from tonight, and what time it is where you are, because I have a feeling some of you are listening to this late, the way I so often find myself awake at strange hours these days. Subscribe if you haven't yet. There's a new story here every single day, and share this with someone if you think they might need to hear it too. Now let me tell you what I saw on that screen. When the young man handed the phone back to me, the screen lit up on its own, no passcode, the way old phones sometimes are when their owner never imagined anyone else would ever need to unlock it. There was a video folder. 47 files, dated across nearly 6 years, the earliest from not long after Robert's 60th birthday party, the most recent from just 8 months ago. I sat in my car in that little parking lot on Northwest 23rd Avenue, the rain drumming on the roof, and I pressed play on the very first one. It was Margaret's voice. Younger, lighter than she sounds now. She was filming something, not herself, but a conversation happening across what looked like our old kitchen table, the one we replaced years ago. And in the frame, half turned away from the camera, clearly unaware he was being recorded, was Thomas. I am going to stop right here because I think you deserve to sit in this moment exactly the way I did. I had no idea, watching that first video, what I was about to learn about my son. I had no idea that the daughter I had quietly worried over for a year had been carrying something far heavier than nerves or grief. I had no idea that the bookshelf I had walked past 10,000 times held the answer to a question I hadn't even fully let myself ask. That's where I'm going to leave it for now. I promised you I'd tell you what was on that first video, and I will. But I think it matters that you understand who I was before I pressed play, because the woman who watched that recording in a cold car on Northwest 23rd Avenue was not the same woman who climbed out of it 20 minutes later. Let me back up and tell you a little about my own life, because I think it explains why I noticed what I noticed and why it took me so painfully long to act on it. I grew up in Eugene, a couple hours south of here, the daughter of a mill worker and a woman who kept books for 3 different small businesses just to make sure there was always enough. We didn't have much, but we had quiet, and we had a particular kind of Oregon stubbornness that doesn't announce itself. It just keeps showing up. My mother used to say that the loudest problems in a family are rarely the most dangerous ones. It's the quiet ones, she'd tell me, the ones nobody wants to look at directly, that do the real damage over time. I didn't understand what she meant until I was much older. I think I finally understood it the year I watched my own younger sister, Diane, slowly stop coming to family gatherings after a falling out with our older brother that none of us ever properly addressed. Nobody screamed. Nobody threw anything. There was just a slow, polite erosion, year after year, until one day Diane simply wasn't there anymore, and by the time any of us tried to ask why, the silence had grown so large that nobody knew how to climb back over it. Diane and I didn't speak for almost 11 years. We found our way back to each other eventually, in my 40s, but I never forgot what it cost us, all that unspoken time. I made a promise to myself back then, quietly, the way you make promises that you don't tell anyone else about. I promised that if I ever saw that same pattern starting in my own family, that slow, polite erosion, I would not let it happen twice. Not on my watch. Not without at least trying to understand it first. That promise is the reason I went looking behind that bookshelf instead of simply asking Margaret directly and accepting whatever answer she gave me. I had learned, the hard way, that sometimes the people closest to a wound are the last ones who can describe it out loud. I want to pause here for a moment, because I think some of you have a Diane in your own life, someone who drifted, quietly, without a single dramatic moment you could point to and say, there, that's when it happened. If that's true for you, tell me about them in the comments. I would love to know I'm not the only one who's lived this particular kind of grief. And if this story is already meaning something to you, go ahead and subscribe now, because I promise you, what I found in that car changes the shape of everything that comes after it. Now, let me tell you about that first video, properly, the way I watched it. The footage was shaky, clearly filmed on a phone held low, maybe resting against a stack of cookbooks on the counter, the way you'd set something up if you wanted to capture a conversation without making it obvious you were doing so. The kitchen behind them was unmistakably ours, the old yellow tile we ripped out in 2014, the calendar from the hardware store that used to hang by the pantry door. Margaret's voice came first, from just off camera. You said you'd tell him before the closing. You promised me. Thomas, half turned away, was older in that footage than I remembered him being at the time, though I suppose 6 years does that to all of us without asking permission. It's not that simple, Maggie. It's exactly that simple, she said. Dad trusted you to handle the property because you told him you'd split it evenly. He believed you. I believed you. I sat in that car and felt something cold settle into my chest because I knew exactly what property they were discussing. A small parcel of land out near Hood River that Robert's own father had left to him decades earlier. Land that Robert always said he wanted divided fairly between his 2 children when the time came, because he never wanted either of them to feel like the other had been favored. Thomas had handled the sale of that land 3 years before Robert passed, when his father's eyesight had started failing and the paperwork had simply become too much for him to manage alone. I remembered it happening. I remembered being grateful, at the time, that my capable, organized son had stepped in to take that burden off his aging father's shoulders. I had no idea, sitting in my own kitchen all those years ago, congratulating myself on having raised such a responsible son, that my daughter already knew something was wrong and had chosen, for reasons I did not yet understand, to carry that knowledge alone. The video ended abruptly, the way home recordings often do, cut off mid-sentence, as though Margaret had heard footsteps and stopped filming out of instinct. I sat with my hands still wrapped around that phone for a long moment before I let myself open the second file. I want to tell you something honestly here, because I think it matters for anyone watching who has ever found themselves on the edge of a discovery like this one. There is a particular kind of fear that comes with learning something about your own children that you were never meant to know. It is not the same fear as danger. Nobody in that car park was in any physical danger. But there is a fear, In realizing that the family you have spent your whole life believing you understood completely has, in fact, been quietly rewriting itself behind a closed study door for years, while you brought casseroles to dinner and asked everyone how their week had been. The second video was shorter. It showed Margaret alone, speaking directly into the camera, her voice low, almost a whisper, as though she were afraid of being overheard, even in her own recording. "I don't know how to tell Mom," she said. "I don't know how to tell her that Thomas let Dad believe a lie for years, and I just stood there and let him do it, because I didn't know how to say it without breaking something that can't be put back together." That single sentence undid something in me that I am still, even now, trying to fully describe. For nearly a year, I had watched my daughter flinch every time her brother entered a room, and I had quietly wondered, in the parts of myself I wasn't proud of, whether something had happened between them that reflected poorly on her. Some falling out she had started, some grudge she was nursing that wasn't fair to Thomas, who had always, in my eyes, been the steady one, the dependable one, the son who called every Sunday, and never missed a single one of his father's doctor's appointments in those final difficult years. I had, without ever saying it out loud even to myself, quietly sided with my son's version of normal simply because it required less of me to believe it. If you've ever caught yourself doing that, favoring the easier story over the truer one, simply because the truer one asks more of you, I want you to know you are not alone. And I am not proud of myself in that car either. Tell me in the comments if you've ever realized, too late, that you'd been believing the wrong version of someone you love. I think that confession matters more than people admit. And if you're still with me, still listening, give this video a like right now. Because what I found in those next videos is the part of this story that finally explained everything, and I don't want you to miss a single word of it. I watched 7 more videos that afternoon, sitting in that parking lot until the man from the electronics shop knocked gently on my window to ask if I was all right, and I lied and told him yes, and drove home with the phone sitting on the passenger seat like it was something alive. What I began to understand, piece by piece, video by video, was not a story of cruelty in the way I had feared when I first found that hidden device. There was no violence in any of it, no threats, nothing that belonged in the kind of dark headline that makes a person's blood run cold. What I found instead was something slower and, in its own way, harder to forgive, precisely because it was so ordinary, so quietly human, so much the kind of thing that happens inside families every single day without anyone ever filming it. Thomas had not stolen from his father in any way the law would recognize. What he had done, across years, in small decisions that each seemed defensible on their own, was construct a version of fairness that conveniently favored himself, while allowing everyone, especially his aging father, to believe he was the family's most selfless son. The land near Hood River had been sold for less than its actual worth to a buyer who turned out, 3 more videos later, to be a close friend of Thomas's from his engineering firm. A friend who had quietly resold a portion of that same land within 18 months for nearly double what he'd paid. Margaret had found out by accident, going through old paperwork while helping Robert organize his files during a difficult stretch after his second hip surgery. She had confronted Thomas privately, just once, and he had asked her, calmly, almost gently, not to say anything to their father. "Dad's health is fragile," he told her. "Why give him one more thing to worry about? I'll make it right eventually, Maggie. I promise you. Just give me time." She had given him time, years of it, and every single year that passed without him making it right had cost her something I don't think any of us, watching her from the outside, ever fully understood, because she never let it show in front of Robert, not once, not even at the very end. I want to stop here for a moment, because I think this is exactly the kind of quiet, slow-burning family wound that so many of us recognize, even if the specific details never match our own. Maybe it wasn't land for you. Maybe it was a debt nobody talked about, or a favor that was never repaid, or a silence someone agreed to keep to protect a parent who was already struggling with enough. If any part of this story is echoing something from your own family right now, I would love to hear it. So tell me in the comments, and tell me where you're watching from tonight too, because I find such comfort in knowing this story is reaching exactly the people who need to hear it. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do, because there is so much more of this story left to tell. And I promise you, what happens when Thomas finally learns these recordings still exist is a moment I think about every single day now. I drove home that evening with 37 videos still unwatched, the rain coming down harder against the windshield, and I remember sitting in the driveway for a long time before I went inside, not ready yet to look at my daughter's face and pretend I didn't know what I now knew. What I did not yet understand, and what the rest of those videos would slowly reveal to me over the following days, was that Margaret's silence had never been about protecting Thomas. It had never even really been about protecting our father, not entirely. It had been about a promise she made to herself, much like the one I made to myself after Diane, a quiet vow that she would hold the family together with her own two hands, even if it meant carrying something alone that none of us ever asked her to carry. I had spent a year worrying that my daughter was unraveling. I had no idea she had simply been holding on for nearly 3 decades. To a truth she didn't know how to set down without breaking something she loved more than she resented. That is where I have to leave you for now. Because what came next, the conversation I finally had with Margaret, the night I confronted Thomas, and the afternoon we all sat together in that same study and watched those videos as a family, deserves to be told slowly and carefully, the way it actually happened. If you've stayed with me this far, thank you, truly, from the bottom of my heart. Tell me where you're watching from, what time it is wherever you are tonight, and if this story has pulled something up in you the way it pulled something up in me, leave that like and subscribe, because tomorrow I'll be back with the next part of this story, and I think you're going to want to hear how it ends. I want to tell you something about the particular kind of courage it takes to ask someone you love a question you're afraid of the answer to, because that is exactly where I found myself the night I finally sat down with Margaret. I didn't do it right away. I want to be honest with you about that because I think honesty is the only thing worth offering you at my age. I sat with that phone for 3 full days before I worked up the nerve to say anything at all. I kept it in the drawer of my own nightstand, wrapped in a dish towel, as though hiding it the way it had been hidden for years might somehow soften what I now knew. I went about my days. I watered the ferns on the back porch. I drove to the grocery store on Northwest 21st and bought the same coffee I always buy and stood in that aisle for a long, strange moment, unable to remember what I had walked in for. If you've ever carried a piece of knowledge that changes how you see someone but haven't yet found the words to say it out loud, I think you understand exactly the kind of 3 days I had. Tell me in the comments if you've ever sat with something like that, a truth too heavy to set down right away. And if this story is keeping you company tonight, the way I hope it is, go ahead and like this video now, because I promise you, the conversation I'm about to describe to you is one I will remember for the rest of my life. I invited Margaret to the house on a Tuesday evening, told her I needed help going through some of her father's old correspondence for the estate, which was true enough that it didn't feel like a lie. Even though I knew the moment she walked through that door, that correspondence was the furthest thing from what I actually wanted to discuss. She came straight from the shop, still wearing the soft gray cardigan she keeps on a hook behind the register, smelling faintly of the cedar incense she burns near the poetry section, because she once told me it helps people slow down enough to actually browse. She looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. I noticed, the way I had been noticing all year without admitting I was noticing, the careful way she set her bag down, the way her eyes moved toward the hallway that leads to her father's study before she'd even taken off her coat. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where, 6 years earlier, she had filmed her brother without his knowledge, though of course it wasn't the same table at all. We'd replaced that one in 2014, but the same patch of floor, the same window, the same rain falling outside it in that soft, relentless Portland way that never quite announces itself as a storm and never quite stops either. I made tea. I always make tea when I don't know what else to do with my hands. "Margaret," I said, and I remember my voice came out steadier than I felt. "I found something in your father's study." She went very still. Not the flinch I'd grown used to seeing when Thomas walked into a room, something quieter, something almost like relief mixed with dread, the way I imagine a person feels when a doctor finally says the word they've been waiting months to hear, even when the word is bad news. "What did you find?" she said. Not a question, really. More like she already knew and was only confirming it for the both of us. I set the phone on the table between us. I watched her look at it the way you might look at an old photograph of yourself from a version of your life you'd worked very hard to forget. "I charged it," I told her. "I watched some of what's on it." She didn't reach for it. She wrapped both hands around her mug instead. And for a long moment, the only sound in that kitchen was the rain and the grandfather clock down the hall, ticking the way it has ticked through every hard conversation this family has ever had in that house. "How much did you watch?" she finally asked. "Enough," I said. "Enough to understand you've been carrying something for a very long time that none of us ever asked you to carry alone." And that is when my daughter, 52 years old, the steadiest, most composed person I have ever known, put her face in her hands at my kitchen table and cried in a way I had not seen her cry since she was a girl of 9, sobbing into a pillow because a friend at school had said something cruel about her glasses. And I had sat on the edge of her bed not knowing yet that some hurts cannot be fixed with words, only with presence. I let her cry. I think that's important to say because my instinct, my whole life, has been to fix things quickly, to smooth things over, to find the right sentence that makes the pain make sense. But I have learned, slowly, painfully, across 77 years, that sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone is simply stay in the room while they fall apart without trying to speed it along. When she finally spoke again, her voice was raw in a way I'd never heard from her. "I was 24 when I found out," she said. 24, Mom. I just started managing the shop. I came over to help Dad with his files because his eyes were already starting to go, and I found a copy of the sale agreement for the Hood River land, and the numbers didn't match what he'd told us. Thomas had told all of us the land sold for $80,000 and split evenly. The actual paperwork said 140, and the buyer's name was Patrick Wexler. I felt something cold move through me, because I remembered that name from the videos, the same friend, the same firm, the same convenient arrangement. "I confronted him," Margaret continued. "Just once. I never told Dad. I never told you. Thomas asked me not to, and I let myself believe it was because he was protecting Dad's health, and not because he was protecting himself." I want to pause here, because I think this is one of the most important things I have ever learned, and I want to offer it to you exactly the way I'm living it right now. Sometimes the people we believe are protecting someone else are actually protecting only themselves, and the line between those two things can be so thin, so quiet, so wrapped up in genuine love for the person being supposedly shielded, that even the person doing it may not fully understand which one is really happening. If that distinction means something to you the way it's meaning something to me right now, tell me in the comments. Because I think it's one of those truths that's easy to nod along to, and very hard to actually recognize while you're living inside it. And if you're finding yourself moved by Margaret's courage in telling me all of this, even decades late, even imperfectly, go ahead and hit that like button, because I think she deserves to be seen the way I am only now finally seeing her. "Why did you start recording him?" I asked her gently. She wrapped her hands tighter around the mug. "Because the first time I confronted him, he denied it so completely, so calmly, that I started to doubt my own memory of the paperwork I'd held in my own 2 hands. He has always been better than me at sounding certain. I went home that night, and I genuinely wondered if I'd misread the numbers. So the next time we were all together, I started recording, just little moments, conversations where he'd let something slip, because I needed proof that existed somewhere other than inside my own head, where I could no longer fully trust myself. I think I need to stop here for a moment and speak directly to whoever is listening to this tonight, because what Margaret just described to me is something I have come to believe is one of the most painful experiences a person can carry. The slow, creeping doubt that settles in when someone you love insists, calmly and consistently, that the truth you witnessed with your own eyes never actually happened. It does something to a person over time. It makes you smaller. It makes you quieter. It makes you start gathering evidence, not because you're plotting against anyone, but because you no longer trust your own mind to hold on to what's real without some kind of proof beside it. If you have ever lived through that feeling, the slow erosion of trusting your own memory because someone else insisted with enough confidence that you were wrong, I want you to know that what you felt was real, and you were not imagining it. And I am so sorry if anyone ever made you feel small for simply remembering things correctly. Tell me in the comments if this part of the story is hitting close to home and where you're watching from tonight, because I think there are more of us than we realize who have lived some version of this. And please, if you haven't yet, subscribe, because there is a great deal more to this story, and I don't want you to miss a single piece of it. Margaret told me, that night, about 3 more incidents she had quietly absorbed over the years, none of them dramatic on their own, each one small enough to explain away, all of them adding up to a pattern she had decided, again and again, not to disturb. A life insurance policy of our own mother's, years earlier, that Thomas had handled the paperwork for, and which paid out slightly less than Margaret remembered being promised when the policy was first taken out. A discrepancy Thomas attributed smoothly to changes in the policy terms over time. Changes Margaret was never able to verify because Thomas had been the one managing the documents. A family loan given to Thomas during a rough patch in his career in the early 2000s that he had repaid to Robert in full, according to him, though Margaret found a notation in Robert's own handwriting years later, suggesting the final payments had simply stopped arriving and Robert had quietly forgiven the remainder rather than make it a source of conflict. None of it, on its own, was the kind of thing you'd take to a courtroom. All of it together painted a picture of a son who had learned very early that steadiness and charm could buy him the benefit of the doubt indefinitely, especially from a father who wanted desperately to believe both his children were equally trustworthy, and a mother, me, who simply preferred the version of the story that required nothing further of her. I asked Margaret the question that had been sitting in my chest since that parking lot on Northwest 23rd Avenue. Why didn't you ever tell me? She looked at me for a long moment, and when she answered, her voice had none of the bitterness I might have braced for, only a tired, aching honesty. Because you and Dad already had a story about Thomas, she said. The reliable one. The one who calls every Sunday. The one who handled everything when your eyesight started going. I didn't think you'd believe me over him, Mom. And even if you did, I didn't think I could bear watching Dad's face if he found out, not when his health was already so fragile. I told myself I was protecting him. Maybe I was also protecting myself from finding out I was right, and it still wouldn't change anything. I sat with that for a long time before I spoke again, because I think it deserved a long time. I am so sorry, I finally said, that I made it easier for you to carry this alone than to bring it to me. I want to tell you, whoever is listening tonight, that those words cost me more than almost anything I have ever said in my life, because they required me to admit something about myself that I am not proud of. I had, without ever meaning to, without ever consciously choosing it, built a family culture where the squeaky wheel got the oil and the quiet, capable daughter got assumed to be fine. I had made it easy for my son's calm confidence to outweigh my daughter's quiet distress, simply because confidence is louder than pain, even when pain is telling the truth. If you are a parent listening to this, or a grandparent, or simply someone who has ever had to reckon with the ways your own assumptions made it harder for someone you love to come to you with the truth, I hope you'll sit with that the way I had to sit with it that night. And if this is landing somewhere true for you, tell me about it in the comments, because I think we owe each other these honest moments more than we owe each other comfortable silence. Subscribe if you want to hear how the rest of this unfolds, because tomorrow's story might be exactly the one someone in your life needs to hear, and I promise there's always a new one waiting for you here. We sat at that table until nearly midnight, Margaret and I, going through file after file, memory after memory, and somewhere in the middle of all of it, she told me something that I think is the true heart of this entire story, something I have turned over in my mind every day since. "I never wanted to destroy him, Mom," she said. "I just wanted, one single time, for someone to believe me without making me prove it first." I think about that sentence more than almost anything else she has ever said to me. By the time she left that night, taking the phone with her this time, tucked carefully into her bag the way you'd carry something fragile, we had not yet decided what to do about Thomas. We had not yet decided whether to involve Daniel, who Margaret admitted she had never told the full extent of any of this, not because she didn't trust him, but because she didn't know how to say it out loud to anyone, including the man who had shared her bed for over 20 years. What we had decided, sitting at that table until the rain finally let up sometime after 11, was that this could not go on the way it had been going on. 30 years of quiet, polite erosion was enough. My promise to myself, the one I'd made after Diane all those years ago, had finally found its purpose, even if I hadn't expected it to arrive wearing my own daughter's face. I drove her home that night myself, insisted on it, though she protested that she was perfectly capable of driving, and we sat in my car outside the small house she shares with Daniel on a quiet street not far from the bookstore, and before she went inside, she turned to me and said something I will carry for the rest of my life. "Thank you for finally looking behind that shelf." I have thought about that sentence every single day since. Thank you for finally looking. Not for understanding right away. Not for believing instantly, because I didn't. Not at first. Not fully. Not until I'd watched enough of those videos with my own eyes. Just thank you for finally looking, for refusing to accept the comfortable version of the story simply because it was easier to live with. If there is one thing I would ask every person watching this tonight to take with them, it would be exactly that. Look behind the shelf. Whatever your shelf is, whatever quiet corner of your family or your friendships you've been politely avoiding, because the easy story is more comfortable than the true one, look behind it. You may not like what you find, but I promise you, the people who have been waiting for you to look will never forget that you finally did. I'm going to leave you here for tonight, because what happened next, the conversation I had with Thomas, deserves its own careful telling, and I don't want to rush through it the way I almost rushed through believing him for 30 years. Tell me where you're watching from, what time it is wherever you are, and if this story is sitting with you the way I hope it is, leave that like, subscribe if you haven't yet, and share this with someone who might need to hear it tonight. I'll be right here tomorrow with the next part. I called Thomas 3 days after that night with Margaret, and I want to tell you honestly, my hands were not steady when I dialed his number. I had raised that boy. I had sat up with him through chickenpox and a broken arm at age 11, and every single milestone a mother sits up for. I had spent 56 years believing, without ever once seriously questioning it, that I understood the shape of his character completely. And now I had to call him and ask him to come to the house so I could ask him questions I already, mostly, knew the answers to. If you've ever had to confront someone you love with a truth you wished wasn't true, I think you understand exactly the particular kind of dread I felt dialing that number. Tell me in the comments if you've ever had to make a call like that, the kind where your finger hovers over the screen a moment longer than it needs to. And if you're still here with me, still listening, go ahead and give this video a like, because I promise you, the conversation I'm about to walk you through changed the way I understand my own son for the rest of my life. Thomas arrived on a Saturday afternoon, the rain having finally taken a brief pause, weak October sunlight coming through the front windows in that pale, watery way it does here when the clouds haven't quite decided whether to commit to clearing. He came in the way he always comes in, easy, confident, kissing my cheek, asking if I needed help with anything around the house. The same steady, capable son I had known my whole life. I had decided, in the days since talking with Margaret, that I would not ambush him. I owed him, I believed, the same patience I had finally extended to his sister, the chance to sit down and explain himself before I let 30 years of quiet assumptions calcify into a verdict I couldn't take back. We sat in the living room, not the study. I couldn't bring myself to have this conversation surrounded by the very shelf that had started it all, and I set a cup of coffee in front of him the way I always have, and I told him, as gently and as plainly as I could manage, what I had found. I watched something move across his face that I had never seen there before. Not panic, exactly. Something more controlled than panic, more practiced, the kind of composure I imagine comes from years of being the person in a room who stays calm while everyone else gets emotional. The person whose steadiness gets mistaken, again and again, for honesty. "Mom," he said, setting his coffee down with great care. "I don't know what Margaret has told you, but I think you need to understand that she has carried a grudge against me since we were kids. This isn't new. This is the same story she's been telling herself for 30 years. I felt something in my chest go very still and very cold because I recognized, with a clarity that frightened me, the exact shape of what Margaret had described to me at that kitchen table 3 days earlier. The calm denial. The redirection of the conversation away from the actual evidence and onto his sister's character instead. I had heard this pattern in the videos themselves, word for word in some places, the same calm voice insisting Margaret was the one with the problem. "I watched the videos, Thomas," I said. "I saw the sale agreement numbers. I saw the discrepancy in your grandmother's insurance policy. I saw the loan repayment notation in your father's own handwriting." He was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, something in his voice had shifted. A different kind of calm now, more brittle underneath it. "You're going to take her side," he said. "After everything I did for Dad those last years, after every single appointment I drove him to, every form I filled out so he wouldn't have to strain his eyes anymore. And you're going to sit here and believe a story built on some old recordings my sister apparently kept hidden for years because she's never been able to let anything go. I want to stop here and speak to you directly for a moment, because I think this part of the conversation taught me something about my son that I had genuinely never understood before, even after 56 years. There's a particular kind of person who has learned, somewhere early in life, that the fastest way out of accountability is to make the conversation about something else entirely, to take whatever pain is being pointed at them and redirect it, smoothly, almost gracefully, back onto the person who pointed it out. I do not believe Thomas sat down one day and decided to become this kind of person deliberately. I think it is more likely that this pattern simply worked for him, again and again, starting so early in his life that by the time he was an adult, it had become as natural to him as breathing, a reflex rather than a calculated strategy. If you have ever been on the receiving end of that particular maneuver where you bring forward a real concern and somehow, by the end of the conversation, you find yourself apologizing for having raised it at all, I want you to know that what you experienced has a real shape to it, even if nobody around you ever named it for what it was. Tell me in the comments if that's ever happened to you and where you're watching from tonight. And if you're still with me, please subscribe, because what happened next in that living room is something I genuinely did not see coming, even after everything. "Thomas," I said, keeping my voice as steady as I could manage, "I am not asking you to defend yourself against Margaret's character. I am asking you about numbers on a piece of paper. I am asking you about a buyer named Patrick Wexler who resold that Hood River land within 18 months for nearly double what he paid you for it." Something flickered across his face at the mention of that name. Quick, almost imperceptible, the kind of expression you'd miss entirely if you weren't already looking for it. But I was looking for it, and I saw it land. "Pat is an old friend," Thomas said. "What he did with the land afterward had nothing to do with me. I sold it for what it was appraised at the time." "The appraisal in your father's files lists $140,000, I said. "Every single thing you told us, told your father, told me, was 80,000, split evenly between you and your sister. Where did the other 60,000 go, Thomas?" The silence that followed felt longer than it probably was. I have learned, across 77 years, that silence in a conversation like this one is rarely actually about confusion. It is almost always about a person doing rapid, careful math behind their eyes, trying to find the version of the story that survives contact with whatever evidence has just been placed in front of them. "There were costs," he finally said. "Closing costs, realtor fees, repairs to the access road that needed to happen before the sale could even go through. I handled all of it so Dad wouldn't have to worry about a single detail. I don't have an itemized list sitting in my back pocket for something that happened years ago, Mom. I was trying to take care of him. I want to tell you something honestly, because I think it matters. Part of me wanted desperately to believe him in that exact moment. There is a particular ache that comes with confronting your own child, a deep, bone-level wish that there is some reasonable explanation waiting just behind their next sentence that will make all of this simply dissolve, that will let you go back to believing the comfortable version of the story you'd held onto for 30 years without complaint. But I had watched those videos. I had sat with Margaret at that kitchen table until midnight. I had heard, with my own ears, a version of this exact conversation happening 6 years earlier in our old kitchen. The same calm voice, the same vague gesture toward costs and complications that somehow never came with paperwork attached. "Thomas," I said, "I need you to understand something. I am not here to punish you. I am here because I spent 30 years believing one version of this family, and I have now learned there was another version sitting quietly behind it the entire time. One that your sister carried alone because she didn't believe any of us would choose to believe her over you. I need to understand why that was the safer assumption for her to make." He stood up then, walked to the window, looked out at that pale October light for a long moment with his back to me. "Because you've always believed me," he said quietly, almost too quiet to hear. "Both of you, Dad too. It was just easier. I never set out to lie to anyone. I just learned somewhere along the way that if I stayed calm and didn't make a big deal out of anything, people generally just believed whatever I told them. It became its own kind of habit, Mom. I'm not proud of it, but I don't think I ever once sat down and decided to deceive this entire family. It just kept working, so I kept doing it. I think that admission, imperfect and incomplete as it was, is the single most honest thing my son has said to me in years. And I want to pause here and offer it to you exactly the way he gave it to me, because I think it explains something important about how these quiet, decades-long family fractures actually happen. They rarely begin with a person deciding, in some single dramatic moment, to become dishonest. They begin much smaller than that, with a habit that works, repeated quietly enough times that nobody ever stops to ask whether it should keep working, until 30 years have passed and an entire family's understanding of itself has been built, unknowingly, on top of it. If that distinction matters to you the way it's mattering to me right now, tell me in the comments, because I think it's easy to want our family stories to have clear villains, and so much harder, so much more honest. To sit with the truth that most of these wounds grow out of ordinary human weakness rather than calculated cruelty. And if you're finding this conversation as difficult to sit through as I did living it, please give this video a like, because I think it matters that we talk about these quieter, harder truths and not just the dramatic ones. I asked Thomas, directly, whether he was willing to sit down with Margaret, with me, and go through those recordings together, openly, without defensiveness, without redirecting the conversation back toward her character. He was quiet for a long time before he answered. "I don't know if I can do that," he said. "I don't know if I can sit in a room and watch myself on a screen from years ago and have everyone looking at me like that." "I think," I told him as gently as I knew how, "that you owe your sister exactly that discomfort after 30 years of letting her carry it entirely alone." He didn't answer me that day. He left not long after, the easy confidence I'd watched him walk in with, replaced by something heavier, something I had genuinely never seen in my son before, not once in 56 years. I want to tell you, whoever is listening to this tonight, that I went to bed that night uncertain whether my family would ever recover the shape it once had, even imperfectly. I had spent so many years believing that love meant choosing the comfortable story, and I was only now, in the autumn of my own life, learning that real love sometimes requires choosing the uncomfortable truth instead, and trusting that whatever comes after telling it is still, somehow, worth more than the quiet, polite fiction that came before. If you've ever had to have a conversation like this one with someone you love, where you weren't certain the relationship would survive the honesty required to have it at all, I want you to know I understand that particular fear better now than I ever have in my entire life. Tell me where you're watching from tonight, what time it is wherever you are, and if any part of this is touching something true in your own life, please subscribe because there is more of this story still to come. And I think what happens next, the day we all finally sat down together in that study, is something you won't want to miss. I'll be back tomorrow to tell you the rest. It took Thomas 11 days to call me back. I want to tell you about those 11 days honestly, because I think silence between people who love each other is its own kind of story, one we don't talk about nearly enough. I didn't call him. Margaret didn't call him either, though she told me during those long, quiet days that she found herself reaching for her phone more than once before stopping herself, unsure whether she wanted an answer or simply wanted the waiting to be over. I spent those 11 days the way I imagine a lot of you have spent your own waiting periods, the kind that come after you've finally said the hard thing out loud and now have to live inside the space before anyone responds. I tended my ferns. I sat in Robert's old study more than I had in the 3 years since he passed, not looking through anything in particular, just sitting in the quiet of that room, in the chair he used to read in, trying to imagine what he would have made of all of this. I think, honestly, it would have broken his heart in a different way than it broke mine, because Robert believed so completely in the version of fairness he'd tried to build between his two children. And I don't know that he would have survived discovering, the way I did, how quietly that fairness had been undone behind his own failing eyes. If you've ever sat with grief and discovery at the very same time, missing someone while also learning something that would have devastated them, I think you understand exactly the strange, heavy quiet I lived in during those 11 days. Tell me in the comments if you've ever carried both of those feelings together, because I think it's one of the harder, lonelier kinds of waiting a person can go through. And if you've stayed with this story through all 4 parts already, thank you truly, because tonight I finally get to tell you how it ends. Thomas called on a Wednesday evening, and his voice, when I answered, sounded different than it had in that living room 11 days earlier. Smaller, less certain of itself. "I want to come over," he said. "I want Margaret there too, if she's willing. I think I need to actually watch those videos, all of them. I think I've spent so many years convincing myself of a version of things that I'm not even sure anymore what I genuinely remember and what I've just told myself enough times to believe." I called Margaret that same night, and I will tell you, her silence on the other end of the line lasted long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. "I don't know if I can sit in a room with him for that," she finally said. "You don't have to do it alone," I told her. "I'll be right there. Daniel can come too, if you want him there." She was quiet again, and then she said something I have thought about every day since. "I think I've spent 30 years preparing for a version of this conversation where nobody believes me. I don't actually know what to do with a version where someone finally does." I think that sentence is one of the truest things I have ever heard another human being say, and I want to offer it to you exactly the way she gave it to me, because I believe there are people watching this tonight who know precisely what she meant. There is a particular kind of exhausting readiness that comes from spending years bracing yourself to be disbelieved. And when belief finally arrives, it can feel almost as disorienting as the doubt did, because you've built your entire defense around a battle that, for once, You don't actually have to fight. If that lands somewhere true for you tonight, I want you to tell me about it in the comments. And tell me where you're watching from, because I think there is real comfort in knowing other people have lived this same strange relief. And if you're still with me, please go ahead and like this video now, because what happened the following Saturday, when all four of us finally sat together in that study, is the moment this entire story has been building toward. We gathered on a gray Saturday afternoon, the rain holding off just long enough, it seemed, to let the day matter. I made coffee, the way I always do when I don't know what else to do with my hands, and we sat together in Robert's old study, the four of us, Thomas and Margaret, on opposite ends of the small sofa we keep against the wall, Daniel beside Margaret with his hand resting quietly on her knee, and me in Robert's reading chair, the phone connected to a small speaker on his old desk, the bookshelf standing behind all of us. Finally, after 3 days of silence and 11 more of waiting, about to give up every secret it had been holding for years. I am not going to describe every single video we watched that afternoon, because I think some moments belong only to the people who lived them, but I will tell you the shape of what happened, because I believe it matters, and because I think it's the part of this story with the most to teach. We watched the very first recording together, the one I had already seen alone in that car park weeks earlier. Margaret's younger voice asking Thomas about the land near Hood River, his calm deflection, the conversation cutting off as footsteps approached. Thomas sat very still through all of it, his jaw tight, his hands folded in his lap the way I remembered him sitting in church as a boy, trying hard to be good, trying hard to be still, trying hard not to let anyone see whatever was happening underneath the stillness. When it ended, nobody spoke for a long moment, and then Thomas said, very quietly, "I remember that conversation. I remember exactly what I was thinking when I said that to you. I was thinking, if I just stay calm, this will pass, the way everything always passes if I just stay calm long enough." Margaret didn't say anything. I watched her hands, wrapped tightly around her own mug, the same posture I'd seen at my kitchen table weeks earlier, and I understood, in that moment, that she was not bracing for an apology. She was simply waiting to see if the truth, once spoken out loud in front of all of us together, would finally feel like enough. We watched 4 more recordings that afternoon, each one a little harder than the last, each one peeling back another layer of a story that had been quietly accumulating for nearly 30 years. The insurance policy discrepancy, the forgiven loan that Thomas had told everyone for years he'd repaid in full, a conversation, painful to watch, from not long after Robert's hip surgery, in which Margaret, her voice trembling in a way I had never heard from my composed, careful daughter, asked her brother directly whether he understood what he was asking her to carry by staying silent. And Thomas, calm as ever in the recording, told her that some things were simply easier left alone. I want to pause here and speak to you directly, because I think this next part is the heart of everything I have learned across this entire experience, and I don't want to rush past it. Somewhere during the 4th recording, I watched something happen in Thomas's face that I had genuinely never seen there before in 56 years of knowing him. It wasn't the careful, practiced calm I'd watched him perform in my living room 11 days earlier. It was something closer to grief, the particular grief that comes when a person finally has to look directly at a version of themselves they have spent decades carefully not looking at. "I didn't know it added up to this," he said, his voice breaking slightly on the last word. "Every single time, on its own, felt small enough to manage. I never once sat down and decided to become someone who did this to his own sister. I think I just never let myself add it all together. Watching it like this, all at once, I don't recognize the person on that screen, and I think that's the most frightening thing anyone has ever shown me about myself." Margaret was crying by then, quietly, and so was I, and even Daniel, steady, quiet Daniel, who had sat through all of this without saying a single word, reached up to wipe his own eyes. "I never wanted to destroy you," Margaret finally said, her voice thick. "I kept those recordings because I needed proof that what I remembered was real. not because I was waiting for a moment to use them against you. I think some part of me hoped I'd never actually have to show them to anyone at all. I think some part of me hoped you'd just come to me one day and tell me the truth yourself, and then I could finally put the camera down and stop needing it. I want to tell you, whoever is listening tonight, that this is the moment in the whole story that has stayed with me the most, more than the discovery in the study, more than the conversation in my living room, more even than the long, quiet drive home from that little electronics shop on Northwest 23rd Avenue. Because I think it captures something true about how families actually heal, when they heal at all. It is rarely the dramatic confrontation that does the real work. It is the quiet sentence that comes after, the one that reveals that even 30 years of silence had never fully extinguished the hope that things could still be made right. If that's true in your own life too, if you've ever held on to hope for someone far longer than seemed reasonable, simply because some part of you couldn't quite let go of who they might still become, I want you to tell me about that in the comments tonight, because I think it's one of the most quietly courageous things a person can do. And if this story has moved you even a fraction as much as it moved me to live it, please subscribe now, because I have so many more stories like this one to share with you, and I would be honored to have you with me for the next one. We did not watch every one of those 47 videos that afternoon. Some of them, Margaret decided, quietly, belonged only to her, small private moments of a sister gathering evidence for a truth she wasn't yet ready to share. And I respected that decision completely, the way I think we all have to respect that not every piece of a person's pain is owed to the people around them, even the people who love them most. What we did do, before that gray Saturday afternoon turned to evening, was something I believe Robert would have wanted more than almost anything else. Thomas told Margaret, in plain, unguarded language, exactly what had happened with the Hood River land, the actual numbers, the actual arrangement with Patrick Wexler, every detail he had spent years carefully not naming out loud. He told her he would make it right, not with vague promises this time, but with an actual figure, an actual plan, worked out that same week with Gerald Whitfield, our family attorney, who Margaret and I met with privately the following Tuesday to ensure that whatever restitution Thomas offered was documented properly, fairly, and completely, this time with nothing left unspoken in a drawer somewhere for 30 more years. I want to be honest with you about something, because I think it matters more than a tidy ending would. The restitution did not undo 30 years of silence. Margaret told me, weeks later, sitting on my back porch with 2 cups of tea going cold between us, that she did not feel instantly whole the moment Thomas finally told the truth, and I think that honesty is more valuable to share with you than any neat resolution would be. Healing, real healing, the kind that actually lasts, does not arrive in a single afternoon, no matter how honest that afternoon manages to be. It arrives slowly, in small moments that have to be chosen again and again, long after the dramatic confrontation has faded into something quieter. What has changed in the months since that Saturday in the study is something I believe matters even more than the money ever did. Thomas now calls Margaret directly, on his own, without me as the quiet go-between. I didn't even realize I had become over the years. They have had 2 more hard conversations since that day, conversations Margaret has told me about only briefly, respecting, I think, both her brother's dignity and her own privacy. But she has told me enough to know that something real is being slowly, carefully rebuilt between them, brick by brick, the way you rebuild anything that took decades to fall apart. Margaret no longer flinches when Thomas walks into a room. I noticed it for the first time at a small family dinner just last month, the 2 of them sitting beside each other at my table, actually talking, actually laughing once, at some small joke about their father's terrible handwriting, and I had to excuse myself to the kitchen for a moment, not because anything was wrong, but because I needed somewhere private to simply feel the relief of it. I think about that bookshelf often now. It stands in the same place it always has, against the same wall in Robert's old study, though Margaret finally let me help her clean it out properly this past spring, The two of us going through every shelf together, every box, every old photograph, nothing hidden, nothing avoided. We found the shoebox of photographs again, the one I'd set on the desk the very day I found that phone, and we went through them together, slowly, naming faces, remembering stories. Margaret laughing at a photograph of her father at 28, impossibly young, impossibly hopeful, standing in front of a car he'd be proud of for the rest of his life. That shelf is empty now in a way it has never been empty before, not because the family's secrets disappeared, but because every single one of us finally decided, together, to stop hiding them behind something we could quietly avoid looking at. I think that is the truest image I can leave you with tonight. An old wooden bookshelf, built decades before any of us were even born, finally standing bare and unburdened in a quiet study where the rain still falls the same way it always has against the window. I want to speak directly to you now, whoever you are, wherever you are watching this from tonight, because I think this story has a lesson in it that matters far beyond my own particular family, my own particular bookshelf, my own particular 30 years of quiet, comfortable assumptions. If there is someone in your life who flinches the way Margaret used to flinch, who quietly excuses themselves from rooms, who has started canceling plans without explanations that quite add up, I would ask you gently to consider that the easy story, the comfortable one, the one that requires nothing further of you, is very rarely the whole truth. I spent a year believing my daughter was simply stressed, simply grieving, simply going through something that would pass on its own, because that belief was easier to live with than the alternative. I was wrong, and being wrong cost both of us years we will never get back. If there is a shelf in your own life, a drawer, a box, a quiet corner you have been avoiding because some part of you suspects what might be behind it, I would ask you to consider looking anyway. Not because every discovery will be as resolvable as ours turned out to be, but because the not knowing, the quiet, comfortable not knowing, costs far more over time than most of us are willing to admit while we're still inside it. And if you are someone who has been carrying a truth alone, the way Margaret carried hers for 30 years, gathering quiet proof because you no longer trusted that anyone would believe you without it, I want you to know that you are not foolish for needing that proof, and you are not bitter for having kept it. You were simply protecting yourself the only way you knew how, inside a family, inside a world that had taught you, again and again, that your memory alone was not considered enough. I hope, with everything in me, that you find your own version of that gray Saturday afternoon, the one where someone finally sits down and watches the whole truth with you, all the way through, without looking away. I want to thank you, sincerely, for staying with me through this entire story. I know it asked a great deal of you, 5 long evenings together, and I am deeply grateful that you chose to spend them with an old woman and her bookshelf. If you have made it all the way to this very sentence, I would love for you to leave a comment with the single word that I think captures everything this story was really about for me, the word reconciled, because I believe only the people who truly listened all the way through will understand exactly why that word matters so much to me now. Please, if this story moved you even a little, leave a like before you go. And if you have not yet subscribed, I would be so grateful if you would, because there is a brand new story waiting here every single day, each one carrying its own quiet truth inside it. And if you know someone tonight who might be carrying a silence of their own, a sibling they have drifted from, a truth they have never quite found the courage to say out loud, I would ask you to share this story with them. You never know which story, on which night, finally gives someone the courage to look behind their own shelf. Thank you for sitting with me. Take good care of the people you love, and take even better care of the quiet ones among them, because sometimes the steadiest person in the room is the one carrying the heaviest weight, and sometimes the kindest thing any of us can do is simply look closely enough to notice. Good night, and I will see you again tomorrow with a brand new story to tell.